abracadabra, and where we are. It's actually a new location, really amazing day here, and actually it's a couple days later because I actually got cut off, as you probably just witnessed, in mid-form because my battery died. And I think I'll leave it there though, because it was a nice little talk. I think I was having a show of the apple, which I don't have right now because I'm down here by the water. But the reality is that was actually not the first, but the second scene or sequence in my new screenplay, Sparkle. And it's a really important one that I want to go through because basically, you know, I want to be able to show you again how I come up with these ideas, even the finite things, the little things that are actually important. And the first being the name of the apple, right? I just think it was really important that I came up with the right name, because this is actually, originally it was going to be bookending the entire script, or hopefully the entire movie. You know, it would start with Meet Annabelle, and that's actually the last shot in the movie too, Meet Annabelle, which we'll get to way later. But now it's the second scene, but that's okay, because I do like this thing with Grandpa and the little kid at the beginning, and running around somewhere over the rainbow. But it's still important, the name of the apple. It can't just be, you know, Cortland apple or Macintosh or Granny Smith, or, you know, believe me, I learned a lot of apple names. I went through that's the first thing I did. I of course went to an apple list, Googled apples, apple varieties, and you know, there's hundreds, and depending on what country you're in. It's like there's so many different varieties because they can crossbreed, I guess, these varieties and make new names all the time. But I wanted it to be a right name, and actually I don't think there is an apple called the Annabelle in real life, but I just kind of crossed it between two different names I found, and I just like the name, and I think it sticks out. But it's important because the original name, actually, in the original draft of my first act that I've been writing, was Sigrid, which is it's actually Cyril, I think is how you pronounce it. It's a hard one to pronounce here in Denmark, but it's a kid's name, it's a woman's name, and it was actually Mass's daughter's name, and he had named their first bottle of wine that they sold to Geranium, I believe, that. I maybe got that wrong, but they definitely, their most popular sparkling apple wine is called Cyril, or Sigrid. And so initially that just made sense, and so the apple was called Cyril, and is a nod to his wine, but it doesn't sound good in English. So, and Annabelle sounds really good, I think, and that's why even the finite things I think matter. You know, reads better and stuff like that. So sorry, Mass, about not including your daughter's name in the name of the apple. And who knows, that can change. It could be anything by the time this thing ever hits the airwaves, if it ever hits the cinematic version, which it will, of course it will. But okay, so the name is important of the apple, of course. And then we go right into, again, I think it's like 3 pages. It's in a classroom, and after saying Meet Annabelle, one of the little wise ass in class, I think his name's Victor, says, after he says Meet Annabelle, he said, my grandfather invented this apple, right? And Victor's like, oh, raises his hand, and he's like, yes, Victor. And Victor's like, what about Adam and Eve? And Adam and Eve, Adam chokes on an apple, and that's why we have the Adam's apple or something. So, so your grandfather didn't basically invent the apple. And of course, it's a miscommunication or misunderstanding. So, it's the kind of thing that basically, as a teacher, Mass has to put up with every single day, with these variety of children or kids that he teaches. And so he has to, of course, say, no, I'm sorry, my grandfather did not invent the apple. He invented this, variety of apple, the Annabelle apple. And, but that's very important because, it displays ownership, and not only ownership, but the value of that particular apple, which is going to spawn this wonderful wine that we will see shortly, right? And so it's sort of like a trademark, copyright, whatever. It's like the only people who have this apple or access to this apple is NASA's family, because they're the ones who produce it and grow it. And that will, again, make this awesome wine that they're about to produce. So that follows up with, the nerdy girl that I think I was just mentioning earlier. I think her name is Mariana. Reminds me of what was her name? Donna Snelling, I think, when I was a kid. She just was, you get visuals from when your childhood, and there's this girl, because girls are usually taller than guys when you're little. And she was like 6 feet tall when everyone else was like 3 feet tall. She was really tall, and she had like these thick librarian clear glasses on. I remember that, with big clear rims. Just real goofy. We're all goofy at that age, but she was probably like 7, but she was a real nerd and knew a lot. That's all I can remember. But so I guess subliminally, it's based on her. But the reality is that I wanted to have a character that could provide exposition, again, the big evil, information that's necessary for the audience to know. But when you have to bring forth this information, this exposition, the big evil, you try to do it in fun or creative ways, or cover it with action so we don't notice that we're getting spoon-fed this material. And she's the delivery vehicle for some of this information. So, for example, let me just get my script up here. So Mass, of course, does combat with Victor and wins that one, and then he goes to Mariana, Mariana raises her hand, and of course she knows all about the story of Adam and Eve. And I actually, this is what you learn when you're actually a writer or a screenwriter as well, when you start doing research. And I actually, I'm not religious, and I'm not that biblical for sure. So when I Googled Adam and Eve, because obviously, first of all, just step back a second. Of course, I wrote Adam and Eve because that's the one thing, if I asked you, what is the most famous apple story on the planet? You had to think about apples. And it just, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, they're eating the forbidden fruit, eating an apple, which they're not supposed to eat or something like that. I couldn't remember the story. I just know it involves an apple, and they're eating an apple. It's, of course, probably first intuition, but sometimes first intuitions are correct, and I think Adam and Eve is correct because it's a big apple story. But ironically, when I read up on it, the apple is actually never mentioned in the story of Adam and Eve, which I have this character, this little tall girl, Mariana, mentioned, because she's basically a walking encyclopedia, or Miss Google, as I think he might refer to her as in the script for a moment. So basically, she calls him on that one, or says there's actually was no apple in Adam and Eve. It's just the forbidden fruit. And Matt says, okay, thank you. And of course, she has to follow that up by asking what varietals that his grandfather used to make this amazing apple. And and he basically says probably the most important line, or one of the most important lines of the sequence, other than the last line, but he basically says, if I told you that, I'd have to kill you. I'd have to kill all of you. And so, of course, he's being facetious. That's the classic, if I told you, I'd have to kill you, ha, 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 line that we sometimes see in the movies or hear or have done in real life as a joke. But, of course, these are kids, so they, this line will come back and haunt them. It sets up it's a setup and payoff. So it's what's called, so you put it in there now and it's paid off later. And that's, of course, in the principal's office in a couple of scenes where he's called in because, probably Mariana went home and told her parents, or one of the kids, and the teacher said he was going to kill them. So, and he has to argue with his teacher, he has to argue with his principal about that he didn't really mean it. He was being facetious. But so that's that setup. But Mariana even knows when they're talking about the apples. When he after he makes that offhand remark about having to kill all of them if he revealed his deep family secret, she follows it up by actually suggesting 2 different apples. She even take it a step further, and I think I've talked about that before. But you want to push things to the limit. You want to max out what you can when you're writing, so without going too far, because you definitely want to make the story believable. But anyway, so the bottom line is that she actually, to make it even more funny, because not just the fact that she knows about Adam and Eve, but that she actually knows some apple varietals, just to prove that she is little Miss Google, right? Or a walking encyclopedia. So she knows about 2 different varieties that could have brought Annabelle together. That's where actually I came up with the name, which was the Anna variety, which is basically from a kibbutz, I guess, in Israel. And then the Belle de Bascoup, I love that name, the Belle de Bascoup. It's a Dutch apple with high acidity, as I think Mariana notes in the script. And of course, Mass is like, oh God, okay, that's nice. But then he has to, thank you, Mariana, and he has to counter that, that's not one of those actually is not correct anyway. If you're asking, how this apple was produced, because the Anna apple from the kibbutz in Israel is from a dry climate, and Denmark is definitely not a dry climate. So then another little girl, I think her name is Laura, shoots her hand up and says, "So your grandfather named his new apple, after his dead wife?" And that's like, "Yeah." And the girl's like, because she's a kid, like, "Well, how did she die?" Totally irrelevant. And Mass is like, "I don't know. I didn't know her. It was way before my time," something like that. But he said the important thing here is that my grandfather had a dream. And this is very important, because this is the theme and the story of, the theme of the movie, the story of the movie. And he had actually 2 dreams, I think Mass says. The first dream was to make or produce the perfect apple. Mass holds up the apple again and says, "And I think this is the perfect apple. It's the best apple I've ever tasted," something like that. And he was a man of science, which is also important, because Mass being the mad scientist winemaker, but he's a man of science, and he created this wonderful apple. And I think Mass uses the term, so science can be used to create something beautiful, which is nice. And then he has to cut off Victor, the wise ass from before, by saying, "And Victor, the second dream," because kids are always ahead of you, they're going to say, "What's the second dream?" So he says, "Yes, Victor." And the second dream was that he actually wanted to create wine here in Denmark that was as good as the wine down in France, the pillar of the wine world, France, which was really difficult, really tough. He made some decent wine in his time, but he was never able to make really, wine on par with the French regions down south, even though he was a man of science. So it was his first dream, he realized he made an amazing apple. The second dream, he never was able to realize. So of course, it's a setup for Mass to realize his grandfather's dream. That's why also the opening scene with him and his grandfather is so important. So then, of course, Mariana, the tall, nerdy girl, shoots her hand up, and Matt says, "Yes, Mariana." And she goes on something about how it's actually important information for us to learn, but that the climate conditions in the Nordic countries are not, optimal for making grape wine. But, however, she points out in the story of Adam and Eve, they actually, the wine they make is actually from different fruits than grapes, other kinds of fruits. Maybe, he should have considered using apples. So she actually, plants the idea right there at the end of that scene, and Mass is just like shaking his head as a teacher, like, oh my gosh. But Mariana's information is actually important, because that's what the story's about. Maybe he should have tried it with apples, which Mass, of course, will do.